Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Chris is enthusiastic but has really bad allergies episode of Connect This. We have a special fun episode. This is getting back to some of our roots where we're digging into a specific issue. I've been wanting to do this for 2 years. So I'm going to introduce our special guest in a second, but let me start off with Travis Carter from USI Fiber, has shaved about as long ago as I have. Welcome.
Well, so apparently there's a November thing where you don't shave. I was going to see if I could actually pull it off. So
You're just going to practice in September or what?
I didn't want to be that one guy where it's all splotchy and looks terrible. I want to end up at the end of November looking cool like Doug. So
nice. Kim McKinley from Utopia Fiber, welcome. Muted, but showing off something there.
Oh gosh, I have my cat scarf on today.
Awesome.
I'm not a crazy cat lady at all. But thank you, Chris. I know where the mute button is now again.
And we have Doug Dawson, who is the professional truth weigher today. Welcome.
Oh, and you know what? In honor of Travis, I'm going to let my beard go until December. We'll just see how big it gets.
Excellent. I'm excited to see that. We are talking today about the history of LTE with Spencer Sevilla. Welcome, Spencer. You want to give a quick background on why we should think that you know anything about this stuff?
Absolutely. Yeah. Hi. Happy to be here. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Spencer. Actually, my first slide is a bit of about me.
Okay. Well, we'll come to that then. We'll hold that in anticipation. In the meantime, I'll just say that you are the person that got the tribal broadband boot camps going. And you and I are both rocking our tribal broadband boot camp shirts today from Hoopa Valley.
Oh, yeah.
And so you're one of the instructors that we regularly use, and you've been doing this for a long time in a lot of places.
That's correct. Yeah, it's been doing this stuff for quite a while.
Cool. So we're gonna start with that in a second. We're gonna have basically a MST3K for those of you who remember Mystery Science Theater 3000, where Travis, Kim, Doug, and I are gonna be occasionally interrupting, perhaps, or commenting on as Spencer goes through some of the history of LTE. And we're going to get a good sense of it. And the goal is not to show off everyone how funny we all are, but really to, I think, like maybe even pop in a couple of anecdotes or cool pieces of history or whatever. But the goal is to really talk about like how we got here with LTE, what problems is it trying to solve, and setting us up for a future discussion where we'll talk about where it is today and where it's going, perhaps with yet another special guest or two. Cool. While we're doing this, just for the note, we talked on previous shows about the FCC, and it looks like by the time this show is over, the Federal Communications Commission will have 5 commissioners on it for the first time in the Biden administration. Ana Gomez is sailing through, I believe, is waiting on the final confirmation vote, but has already survived multiple votes, has received the support of, I believe, all the Democrats and a few Republicans, and it seems like nothing is in the way. Although apparently Ted Cruz is talking a lot right now about how the FCC is going to destroy the internet by regulating it like a utility. So,
it's going to be right. It's going to be regulated by 5 o'clock. That's my bet. So.
Right, it'll be heavily regulated by 5 o'clock, which means it will go back to being $5 per month to use. It will work all of the time. And it will cost a lot of money to visit websites outside of your area code. So. Unfortunate,
but didn't we have a bet of when we would get the 5th FCC commissioner?
We did, and I'm winning it. I'm pretty sure that I'm about to win that bet.
And I'm winning it. Okay, do we?
Hey, I've won one. Give me the one. You know,
he's 100% lost, but he got this one right so far. Okay, I love it.
I'm excited to be out of the 3 digits in terms of the percentage of things I get wrong. So.
Oh man,
all right.
That's batting a perfect score almost, huh?
I am going to also, I should note that ordinarily we are produced by Rye, and he does a lot of cool things. Right now, a cool thing he's doing is vacation. So we don't have him today. I'm running behind the scenes. So if there's any weird shenanigans, it's on me. I'm about to launch the presentation, I think. There we go. All right. So, all right, Spencer, we can now see your first slide. If you'd like to launch into this, also, if people want to throw anything into the chat, into the comments, if you're on the YouTube streaming site or Facebook or LinkedIn, I think we can see all those. So please do throw any comments into the chat, and we'll address them as we go through. But Spencer, let's knock people's socks off with the history of LTE.
Let's do it. Final caveat on the chat is I cannot see anything except the slide that I'm presenting. So you guys will have to throw popcorn and yell them out to me or whatever.
I will do that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. So my name's Spencer. I always try to start off with the most honest about me's. I did my undergrad at UC Davis. I studied computer engineering. I lived in a dome and I loved it very much. That was mostly what I did in undergrad. Worked for Apple for a little bit as an engineer in the kernel. Did not like doing that as much. So I went to UC Santa Cruz for graduate work. Also, again, computer science. I got a doctorate, but spent most of my time surfing and building tree houses. Towards the end of my time at UC Santa Cruz, I started dating a clown. She moved to Seattle. I followed her up there. We're now engaged. As a result of this, I had to find work. So I ended up I joined the University of Washington, first as a postdoc and then as a research scientist. And now I'm loosely around, but I do a lot of work independently consulting. And generally as a warning for good or for bad, I tend to be a bit of a tech skeptic. This is not a traditional, living in Silicon Valley and loving it type story. I'm generally trying to do other wonderful things with my life. But despite this, we've also done a lot of technical stuff. When I did my graduate work, I got really interested in wireless networks and, the whole wireless mesh stuff, right? Where you can have my phones talking to my laptops, talking to some other thing. We're going to build the internet this way. And that stuff is still interesting, but I think is really, really hard and is not what we're going to be talking about. Because around the time that I moved to Seattle, I met Curtis Heimerl, who's a professor at the University of Washington. And he had been doing kind of small scale, off-grid cellular networks in various parts of the world. I got super psyched. I joined his lab. We did this in Indonesian Papua. There's a picture of me and another grad student, Matt Johnson, and the local community tech expert, Mr. Ebel. And so we have been kind of working on cellular open source stuff since about, I would say, 2016, because we launched the network in 2017. And since then, I've been doing a lot of cellular stuff for quite some time. I've worked in Indonesia and Oaxaca. I've done a lot of work up in the Canadian Arctic. As Chris mentioned, I've done a lot of teaching with respect to tribal America. We launched the tribal broadband boot camps. And so I've been working on basically just all forms of internet access, usually community owned or municipality owned. And in this process, just by virtue of having worked on it for a while, I've learned a ton about LTE. I had to teach myself a lot of it. It was very unintuitive. And so I love kind of just sharing a lot of the context that I've just gathered over the years of working on kind of a bunch of open source software and just open source networks. And so what I want to share for this is we'll do a little bit of background about kind of the internet and the telephone systems that used to be separate. Then we're going to start talking. We'll just go through kind of cell phones. It's going to be the majority of the focus. And then just kind of throughout this, I think there's a question of why am I here? Why should we care about any of this? Which is always a really valid question. So that's kind of when I'm trying to keep it relevant, but chime in, riff. There's lots of room for anecdotes and just chatting around about all this. So anything before I dive in?
No, I think the bit about why you should care, I think, is that we've talked with Deb Simpier previously, but LTE is, I think, the future of LTE is not just your mobile device, right? This is something that actually could do a lot more, and I feel like there's a lot of potential for cool non-commercial type of things even with this. But this also falls into a little bit of the discussion we've had before about. And I think with Deb actually about a discussion of should everything be kind of open and mesh? Should we move into that or should it be more structured and centralized? And is LTE centralized or not? So that's some of the stuff we were going to be moving into. That's why I think it's important to get a sense of how we got here.
Totally. these are conversations that we have up at the University of Washington. Our lab is kind of always chatting about these types of like, is it centralized? Does it have to be? What else could we build? Shout out to Deb. Obviously, I like the team at LTE. I work really closely with them. I help design a lot of the LTE stuff that they've been running. So like, I often end up popping up with cool people doing cool projects. Just to so, anyways, we're gonna I'm gonna start. Because really this podcast is more internet centric. I wanted to start by bringing us back to the 60s. We're going to do a really, really quick rundown of the internet. The main reason why, and I think it's important to kind of call out some of these dates because they give things in context when we have two completely unrelated systems. So when we talk about the total beginning of the internet, there's the ARPANET, started in 1969. ARPA or DARPA, depending on the political climate, they've added the D on and taken it off like about a half dozen times. But you have this network kind of universities, and you're connecting them all. By the late 70s, you've got a couple of dozen nodes. Here's a map of it. A lot of them East Coast, a lot of them West Coast. There's also Hawaii over like a big radio link. I guess it's on there. Yeah, it's that little T. So this happens. This kind of grows throughout the 70s. And a couple other really important foundational moments here. TCP/IP gets invented in a 74 paper by Vint Cerf. Here he is repping the IP over everything t-shirt. It gets formally standardized in the early 80s. And this whole TCP/IP thing really quickly kicks off a ton of innovation. It lets you innovate below the stack, building all sorts of new protocols and like link technologies. And it lets you innovate above the stack, inventing new protocols like mail or DNS or kind of whatever you need. And things start exponentially growing. Personal computers become a thing that helps a lot. The web becomes a thing, right? And we all kind of know this story.
First of all, is that Doug in the picture? I just wanted to make sure that's not Doug.
I just have that in those days I had not gray hair. So
That is the only known photo of Vint Cerf not wearing a three-piece suit.
Yeah, I know, right? I've met him a couple times, and that man is impeccably dressed always. It's amazing. And especially because he's at like a tech conference. Everyone else is usually in a frumpy t-shirt, so it just like doubly pops. To kind of wrap up the internet thing, a couple concepts that a lot of people are kind of familiar with the idea of the internet is you have these different networks, and each one can be kind of administered separately. And within a network, each link could be a different physical thing, right? It could be dial-up, it could be Ethernet. The network itself doesn't really know what content it's delivering. It's just you have routers, and they're kind of made to be dumb, and they work on source and destination addresses. You take stuff, you break it up into packets. Routers are just sitting here like, okay, this packet is destined for that address. And, I'm drilling on these points because the phone system is built pretty differently. And we're going to start kicking over to that. So this is an early picture of Leonard Kleinrock, who got the cred for the first message ever sent over the internet, the first message in the ARPANET. He was trying to type login, and he got the letters low out before it crashed. So everyone was like, lo and behold. But anyways, we talk about this as if like this was the dawn of the internet, and before it was like a primordial ooze. But this is totally false. The phone system already existed nationwide. We talk about this like initial message, and he called SRI. He's like, did you get this message? Right? So we have already built a nationwide communications network at this point that is running almost to the point of ubiquitousness that we kind of forget that it exists.
Although still, even decades later, not available in many tribal areas, just to make sure people have a sense. I mean, there's even now, I should read an article, the Shakami Bedwankanon, which are in Prior Lake, Minnesota here, have a fantastic amount of wealth at this point from the casino. But even 10 years ago, I think, did not have phone service to everyone in a very small area in the tribe because they'd just been locked out of it. So
and now notice also that it's a shrinking network because lots of places are having the copper ripped down, so it's getting smaller and smaller. So
yep,
yeah, absolutely. And and even well through the 2000s, and I think even 2010s, they were still connecting people even with just like plain like regular copper wire phone service, right? These networks are still running, they're still rolling them out, and there's always, I shouldn't say there's always because that's like a future prediction, but there's their underserved populations have been underserved for so many ways and on so many levels. That's a lot of why we do the work we do, right? It's the same as people were riffing earlier about electric co-ops, and we can, like we won't get on that tangent because this is an LTE talk today. But anyways, so to give context, we're talking about the internet in the 60s. But the first transcontinental phone call, New York to San Francisco, happened in 1915. There's oodles of improvements, lots of court cases, lots of technological things. It's all interesting. Is incredibly out of scope for this, and I'm the wrong person to talk about it. I always plug the Master Switch. This is a fantastic book, I think. But this is kind of like, the phone system is here. It's growing. It's like innovating. And like one of the things that kind of blows me away in the telephone system, often, was designed before the internet. So a lot of the internet ideas kind of came looking at it and saying we can do better. But there's a couple of key concepts in telephony land. And, as much as I hate this, it was like this big nationwide network, right? The famous Bell monopoly, and then they broke them up and they all kind of reconverged anyways, which is incredibly frustrating. But even when it's not a single network, it's a much smaller number of them. And the network is not based on routers that are just blindly forwarding packets and source and destination addresses and all this great innovation. The network's based on physical circuits that are set up between two callers. So you call someone, and whether it's a touch-tone phone or it's a rotary, or you talk to the operator and they plug you in, there's back, and I think still to this day with what they call plain telephone service, there's a continuous piece of copper wire from your phone that runs all the way to theirs, which still kind of blows me away, kind of melts my brain a little bit that's how it works. But I mentioned all this because these are two incredibly different ways of thinking about communications, and kind of with a brief history of both, I think it kind of helps give us context as to what was built with cell phones and why, because that's really where I want to spend more of my time talking.
Yeah, I didn't want to jump in and ruin your surprise, but I think what's interesting is your disbelief at the engineering required to have that copper line continuously connected, when all of the engineers for whom that was just like, Monday, they had no belief. They fundamentally believed it could not work to have a system that would work if you broke messages up into packets. And then you have this decentralized approach in which anyone could forward the packet or not. They could just decide to throw it away. And the idea that would then result in the kind of system that we have today, like, I think it was a very uphill battle. And even I'd say like 7 or 8 years ago, I was involved with people who are probably still out there insisting that this system did not work because of the freedom of different nodes to, behave in ways that would not be helpful for the rest of the system.
Well, it's these voices are still quite prevalent today, and I think a lot of this is reflected even in the LTE and 5G specifications. Like, I talked to telecom engineers and I'm like, oh, check it out, just send it to a router. And it's like, what? Like, you can't do that. Like, well, what about quality of service? What about this? And they start like giving all these panicked what ifs. And, anyone who's grown up in like when I learned computer networks of TCP IP, and you're like, the routers figure it out, don't worry.
Yeah, I don't know if Doug wants to share anything, but I mean, I'm sure you saw a lot of those fights over the years.
When I started in telephony, there were still places. My first client still had a switchboard like on the screen there. I mean, it was, a lot of that stuff didn't die till the 70s. It's amazing. So yeah.
Totally. Man, I was gonna riff something off of same idea. Just these totally different paradigms, right? And it's crazy to watch these two different ways of seeing the world kind of conflict and argue, and the assumptions and stuff that they bring. Where you talk to someone and like, well, how will you guarantee X and Y? And you're like, dude, it's a switch. It's gonna work. I can't, these are, like a lot of the theory about using datagram routing and like, how stuff's gonna get there and packet switching. A lot of great math theory that's like in the 70s and early 80s, and you're like, this has been settled for 50 or 60 years, but just different approaches, right? And we'll talk a lot about that as we get a little bit more, as we get through the generations.
Cool, let's do it.
Great. So we're in this copper wire system, and early 1980s, we start seeing the first cell phone networks. And this is the 80s, so we're talking car phones, we're talking, these like, head-sized bricks. And they don't really do, I shouldn't say that they don't do a lot, because wireless calls are impressive, right? Especially when you've built a copper wire network. But the cell phone network's first G is basically just a one-hop wireless extension to the rest of the publicly switched telephone network. So it's, these telephone guys, they've built a copper network, they're proud of it. Some of the copper goes to wireless, to like a radio that shoots it out to your phone. But aside from that last hop, everything else is just the regular phone network built out of copper, runs the same way, the end. And that's not meant to poo-poo it. And as a side note here, when we talk about cell networks, this is a diagram from like some of the first theoretical papers on this. And they look like biological cells is where the name comes from. And when we talk about cell networks, specifically, we're referring to you've built a bunch of different radio towers and they're coordinated and they're using different frequencies so that they're not using the same frequency too close together. And then you can reuse them after there's enough space, and you model them out typically using, back in the math theoretical days, they used hexagons, which is why they ends up looking like this. A big part of the initial goal was covering people making phone calls on trains in France. So they have to do handoff and stuff, and they have to be, they've always had to support like freeway speed, basically, which is, impressive when you think about going from one Wi-Fi hotspot to another or whatever. And of course, you're going to have glitches in your call. So 1G is okay, cool. That's like really close to the phone networks. And then 2G is where things start cell phone networks really take off and become like a thing in and of themselves, like a capital T thing. The first 2G networks were launched in 91. They grew through the 90s. And there's a ton of incremental improvements. They go from analog voice signals to digital. There's a ton of software controlling the network. They add authentication and sometimes encryption of the signal. But one of the most important shifts here is that the cell network is now its own thing. It can stand alone. And so you can start doing things like cellular only features, right? Because one cell phone calls another. You're starting to see the rise of like nationwide networks. Phones are getting cheaper, so more people have them. You can start rolling out things. It's not going to, in 1G, you're just going to break the copper wire network if you try to send something like a text. It doesn't even make sense. It's an analog, it's a voice network only. But you've got the cell phone only network, and you start adding software. You do voicemail, you do texts, you do, there's like all sorts of weird software things that people do. You can make like text menus. Network can do stuff like text one, like text this to opt in or opt out. Like you can start putting software and kind of logic in this network. There's, let's see, a lot of the software in 2G, it's kind of the main cellular industry becomes a thing. And a lot of the software is designed incredibly complexly. I'm going to skip having a diagram of a 2G network software. It's like 11 or 12 different pieces of software that are really complex, and they're all talking to each other. And it's architected pretty poorly, but it hits the requirements of the network. 2G itself, this is actually important. It's standardized in just 4 bands. There's 850, 900, 1800, and then 1900 megahertz. So most of these are owned by a nationwide incumbent. So you can basically you're kind of limited in the sense of you can have like 4 operators and then like, you're done. But in terms of the spectrum usage, it's incredibly efficient. And I think oftentimes me and Steve Song have had some chats about this, where for barely any spectrum, we're talking 200 kilohertz a call, you can get voice service out to people. And I still think this is almost like the apex of how much spectrum you need and how much social utility you're like adding to it. Especially you can do texts and stuff too. And so 2G, I think, is like incredibly socially revolutionary as a thing, and still serves a huge chunk of the world today. And even in the US, Verizon ran their 2G network until 2020. T-Mobile just shut theirs down last year. So these ran for a really long time, and they are still like serving a huge chunk of the world's population. This is not.
There are billions still using this. Yes. I mean, it's a huge number. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. I had a partner, and we were buying old AT&T 2G cell sites and shipping them overseas and setting them up because they couldn't get them fast enough. So, yep.
For sure, because I think the difference is like, I think worldwide internet penetration is like slightly over half of the world's population. I think it might be 54% now or something, but phone coverage is like basically 90%. So that difference, that 40%, is going to be 2G coverage, right? Because LTE counts as internet access. So we've got
before we go to 3G, I'm curious. You said the 2G stack is like not well designed. Like, is that just because of how much better it got? Like, was it rushed? Why?
It was rushed to market. It was rushed to market. They just had, they had these spectrum auctions here in the U.S. And once they gave those out, everybody wanted to start making money at it because they went from those 1G car phones, which were ridiculous, and all of a sudden, they didn't think there would be much demand. You had to go back and find an original 2G business plan. The cell companies didn't think anybody would want this. And all of a sudden they put these out and everybody like us on here wanted one. And then they had to rush it to market. So they went way too fast, but it worked. I mean, it was awkward, but who cares? It works.
Don't you remember the good old days when it worked all the time?
Yeah.
I mean, we're making phone calls, that is.
Yeah. I mean, the good news is it was a complicated stack of software, but it wasn't trying to do anything that was too complex. So, I mean, it got it done. So, yeah.
Well, so there's also a couple like weird other snafus, like right now, and I keep meaning to use this acronym, but it doesn't exist because it's 91 and we're talking about 2G. The 3GPP is the group that's in charge of like kind of coordinating all the cellular standards. And they came around in 3G because 2G was coordinated. It was like not really coordinated when they invented a lot of the things. So I'm the wrong person to know this level of detail, but I've known a couple of people. If you want to start building an open source 2G thing, as the good folks at Osmocom have done, one of the contradictions you hit is that there's a couple of self-contradictory things inside the spec itself. And so you can't just build some software that'll work with anyone. There's kind of a question of like, well, the Nokia base stations handle this way, and the Ericsson's one handle it that way. And so you kind of got to make a choice. And so there's weird lock-in, and there's like, but this happens again. This was, people were rolling this out in 91, and we learned a ton about protocol and system design since then. And we've also just like, we also now have a group that's kind of coordinating and trying to sniff these things out before they get running in production. And then you're like, oh, shoot. I think they use like a 7-bit byte to encode like text messages. It's something really, there's a lot of really dumb stuff that came out of 2G.
And we also have a comment from Ezra about the that Nokia phone and how he's leaving it to his grandkids in his will because it was that good.
It'll still be working. Oh, yeah.
First of all, he still has it. Is Ezra a hoarder? I mean, we just need to know.
It's indestructible.
Right.
Yeah, if you want one, I'm sure you can find it in landfills all across the United States, unfortunately, where it should not be. Go ahead, Spencer.
All right, cool. All right, so we've got these 2G networks. They're great. You can do text and things. Wrong keyword. And but it's no longer 1991. The internet becomes a thing throughout the 90s, throughout the 2000s, and like that's great. You obviously want like the kind of question of can we put internet access in this network becomes an immediate question. And so when you think of 2G to 3G, they do some improvements. They do a bit of re-architecture, but most stuff is the same. They basically just say, we're going to take this network that's really similar to a 2G network, and we need to add internet to it. But we're still talking about like a circuit switch network that was oriented for phone calls. And so kind of the classic answer, like how do you add internet traffic to a circuit switched phone network? You just put a modem in it. And so this is not exactly like a 56K modem, but this is essentially what they did. You take a 2G network, you kind of duct tape an internet router on the side, and you say, cool, have the phones call it. The phones set up a circuit to this internet router, send your data there. The entire network becomes just one hop in the internet. The data rates are better than 56K, right? They're up to 4 megabits, I think, in the 3G spec. But this idea is basically the same. Weird piece of trivia, if anyone has ever tried this. This is why up through 3G, you can't call someone and surf the net at the same time. It's the same, like, it's using the line for that. It's busy, like you can't interrupt it, right? Like in the house, you're downloading something and someone makes a call, like the classic dial-up days, right?
Well, this was CDMA, right? Or was it before that? Because I remember when the iPhone came out, one of the big deals about it, because it was on AT&T, it had it wasn't limited. Whereas I think all Verizon and T-Mobile, or Verizon and Sprint, I think, had the CDMA 3G, which did not allow you to use data while making a phone call even then. But I don't know if that's coming up in your presentation. Just a memory that I have.
I think even so, back in the 2G and 3G, you had the CDMA links, then you had the GSM links. And I think with either one, I'm not sure if I don't think you can do voice and data, or if you did, it would tank the rate so dramatically.
I think AT&T had just done something around the time the iPhone came out. I don't know if anyone else remembers that, but I recall, and maybe it was the second version of it, but it was like a big deal briefly where like, oh, like I can like put you on speakerphone and I can like find that contact in my online book, and then I can, Kim's nodding.
Yeah, no, I totally remember that, because I was like, you can multitask on a phone for the first time ever.
What I remember they did was they actually made 2 connections to your phone, if I remember.
Huh.
Yeah.
That would make sense. That'd be the only way to do it.
Yeah, because only some carriers had it, I thought at the time.
Yeah,
but
not everybody had it. Yeah.
Because I remember the opposite. I remember someone calling me for directions, and I tried to look in the maps, and it was like, no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyways, this is kind of how we get from 2G to 3G. Is we take a 2G network, we rename some of the things, we improve them a little bit, and we just duct tape a router on the side. And so what's crazy to me often with any of these standards is you have this slow march of like when something gets standardized and when it starts actually rolling out. Because the standard was finalized in 2001, and they start rolling stuff out, right? They've got Blackberries and PDAs and some other kind of like a handful of things that I don't even think about. Because when I think about 3G, I'm thinking about, we're talking about smartphones. So we've got the iPhone 2007, iPhone 3G in 2008. First Androids come out the very end of 2008 through 2009. So we have these phones, right? Everyone's very excited about them, and 3G immediately like falls over. Like when people were talking about AT&T, if you guys remember, there was a lot of controversy because the iPhone had an exclusive thing with AT&T, but then AT&T's network was like not keeping up with demand, and Apple was really upset about it. I remember like lots of people throwing a lot of shade back and forth.
Yes.
And the reason why is because I mentioned you have these kind of gateways, these routers that are internet gateways, and that every phone has to make a call to. So they become bottlenecks. There's a lot of processing. They start bottlenecking the network. But the other thing is once you start going to data, your network traffic explodes. A lot of people don't really appreciate how efficient voice is, and that the average phone call is, back in 2G, it was 13 kilobits per second. Even now with HD voice, you can get up to like 40 or 50 kilobits per second, and that's for bidirectional. So voice is incredibly low. It's light. And then lowest end, way back in the day, you're streaming YouTube, that's 400 kilobits. It's the equivalent to 30 calls at the same time. So you get
right. But isn't there an issue that like the problem with voice is that it's constant, whereas the other stuff is like intermittent, right? So is that not play a role in the weight of it in some ways?
No, that's a really great question. This was for streaming. You're right that voice is constant, and that's why when you have like a circuit style network that they've built through 2G and 3G, it's perfectly optimized for things like consistent service of phone calls, and just gets hammered by, because you say you're going to look at one web page, right? You have to call this gateway, set up a nice connection, get this all going, stream, or not even stream, sorry, that's the wrong word. You download, like even web pages are going to be a handful of megabytes. So, the network just got like punched in the face by comparison, right? As opposed to it was set up to handle however many phone calls at like, 13 kilobits each, right? And then you just start seeing like, so the problem is that the volume of data is so outsized compared to phone, and everyone's doing this, right? Everyone wants to like use their smartphone to do all sorts of networking things, right? And so this kind of segues over. And so you have a situation like almost immediately after smartphones launch, which is you've built this big cellular network. It's circuit switched and it's designed for phone calls, but you're just getting slammed with internet traffic, and the scale is ridiculous. Websites are getting bigger and more bloated. Your network is like screaming at you, just redlined all the time. And, just you have this inversion of things, right? Because again, we talked about this earlier. There's this internet way of like datagrams and packet switching, which scales pretty well for this kind of stuff. You've kind of chosen the wrong thing. You've optimized yourself for these circuits, which makes sense for 13 kilobit voice calls. And so people at this point, it's also, we're talking the mid to late 2000s. So you're seeing all these scalability issues, but you also have a lot of insight from the internet, right? We're starting to enter like the cloud era. There's so much research. There's a lot of computer science. We've talked about scaling these things. And this is where before I really start digging into the LTE part, this is kind of the main impetus, kind of the origin story here is we're going to take this stuff that went from 1G to 2G to 3G, and we've kind of been adding cruft on it. We're going to start with a clean slate, and we're going to start also with the understanding that internet data is going to be the bigger, the really more important and heavier load on this network than voice calls.
And Spencer, can I ask, like, if I recall correctly, and I've spent a long time since I went into this, the actual standards and things behind like what we call 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, there's actually like multiple standards within there, right? I mean, it's actually like 18 or 19 is 5G, I think, right? And so like there's actually like different things that are going on within what we would say is 1G. There's actually like multiple different innovations within there.
Absolutely. And this is classic cellular land. They have like 50 different acronyms for everything. And so the G's are actually defined based on speed. Like, all right, if you can provide this much, then your network is 3G versus like 4G versus 5G. And so that's almost a completely different vertical stack than over here. There's all these technologies where you have like GSM, then you have like, there actually were some ways to do data in 2G. It's like, Edge, and then there was a GPRS, they pronounce it Jeepers. And then there's like, 3G, and then there's like LTE and LTE advanced. And there's all these like other dumb things, right? In these iterative releases, but you're spot on. And then the ones that we call a certain G is just based on how much speed it can theoretically more than actually, but that's these two closely related yet totally unrelated bonds of like speeds and also technologies used. It's pretty unhelpful, to be honest.
Okay. Who all has rocked Edge and GPRS? I'll never forget using that. I thought it was the most amazing thing at the time. Data on your phone, you could play snakes and do texting, like, to get an A or C, I had to press the number 1 3 times. These were the days. Kids will never understand the pain.
Well, and I don't know if you got into it, Travis. I was never into texting at that point, but like friends of mine, the T9 algorithm, like they would just be sitting there talking with one person, and like with their other hand, like under the table, would be like texting someone this like message in T9 because they got so used to it.
People were so good at that on that Nokia. Yeah. Texting, the first time I saw it, I was overseas, and people used it like crazy in Europe. And there was nothing here, but then obviously it kind of took off from here. Those of us all blue text today understand. We have a few green texters on the show, but
we don't like to mention them.
Moving along.
All right, so I mentioned the G's based on speeds, not technologies. So LTE stands for long-term evolution. In this context, I think is like the whole goal is to kind of give context around that name. So we're gonna redesign the cellular network, and we're gonna focus around broadband internet speed, and we're gonna dip our toes into packet switch routing, which has like only been around since 74, right? It's this new untested technology. We're telcos, and we're kind of insecure. We're gonna dip our toe into packet switching, and so the network is gonna be based primarily around IP addresses. There's some things in the standards where we have better codecs now, so you can do more with the same amount of spectrum. We're also going to standardize bigger amounts of spectrum so that we have access to hundreds of megabits of speed, because we need to start talking about broadband. And but the biggest thing is we're going to re-architect this stuff around datagrams. So back in the previous Gs, your phone kind of has an identifier from its SIM card or like whatever. I don't know if 1G had SIMs. And it just says like you get this amount of channel to call this person. And now we don't do that. I mean, what we do now is a phone joins the network and says, cool, here's your IP address. And so we're using IP addresses now as almost like a primitive for all these things in the network to talk to each other, which is great. And also is like very, this is telcos playing around with new technology in 2009. So to this point, phones in LTE, every phone has an IP address. They send and receive data through the network. And there's all sorts of other services, like, the network still does voice, it still does text, it does all those other things. But all these services are just provided on top of this base IP network. So when we talk about voice LTE, it's really just VoIP with a bit more optimizations. In my eyes, when I look at it from a technical perspective, I joke that a lot of, with this re-architecture, cellular companies basically have shifted from a telecom that also provides internet service. They've kind of turned themselves into an ISP that also provides voice and text and telecom services. They are still regulated like a telco. This is not an opinion that the regulators share. And we'll talk a little bit more about all those regulatory differences, I think, in some of the later slides. Cool. So I mentioned how LTE is really like starting to become like an ISP-centric technology, but it's also still a telecom technology, right? It's designed by cellular people. It's come almost completely out of the like a background of cellular telephony, just kind of grabbing a couple of ideas from networking. So when phones make a call, for example, they get a different radio resource. We put them on a different radio channel. We reserve it just for them. We prioritize the traffic. We say, all right, this little radio channel is going to get all the priority. It's going to go through no matter what. And because LTE is a telco technology, it's designed for telcos. And it's important to mention that there's a lot of regulations and a tremendous amount of oversight for telephone networks. So cell networks have really high uptime requirements, and these can come almost with sometimes legal and criminal penalties, depending on how bad you screwed up. They're aggressively regulated, with the Telecom Act of 1996. And, this is not like some sort of, I know we often like to complain about the lack of regulatory oversight, but the Telecom Act has so much more teeth than whatever non-regulatory existence that the internet lives in. Because over here in the Wild West, it's the internet way. You have routers, packet switching, kind of best effort approach. And the telco way is the exact opposite. It's, it's almost like the Nazi Germany version of there are guarantees and we will do this. And it's an incredibly, these are two different types of networks, but they've also come up with these two different philosophies and approaches towards service. And so it's a wildly different context. And I always feel like
there's a big downside to that, because when they first introduced LTE with that concept, once a cell site got X number of 100 people on, it wouldn't take the next call because all the channels were assigned out. And so any kind of emergency happened or whatever, and 90% of the people couldn't get a phone call. And if you got on one, you never hung up because you would keep your call forever. And so, that was the big downside to it, because I only want to use voice. I want to use those tiny little packets, but I'm tying up a whole channel on this cellular side. It was really a stupid design, but that's what they did. So, yeah.
For a long time, until they actually rolled out VoLTE, LTE networks ran alongside a 2G network, and they would kick you to 2G to make the calls.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to throw in, you mentioned this several times, but this like the internet way versus the telco way. People ever see the term nethead versus bellhead? You come across those people who kind of had that deterministic circuit switched mentality versus those who are more of the freewheeling internet way. And I think it is important to note that one of the fears that some people have, which I think is misplaced, is that government will overregulate in the internet. And I think we don't want that to happen. We don't want a government body to decide how long queues should be, or, when it's okay to discard packets or things like that, right? We really want to keep that a decision made by engineers and multiple stakeholders probably.
But there's never been any talk of anyone wanting to do that. Yeah.
Right. That's not a danger, but it's nonetheless, it is worth noting, that is the sort of thing that government has done in the past for some technologies, and we would not like to see that here.
No.
Didn't Ted Cruz just say that we were going to regulate it?
Ted Cruz would like to raise money by stoking fears that we're about to do that.
It's do you often listen to Ted Cruz though?
No, as a functioning human being, I do not.
Yeah, and something that's really interesting here when we talk about regulation is that it exists in kind of multiple tiers, because even when people talk about regulating the internet, I think it often comes up in this common carrier Title II type legislation. And it's important to mention that that is, I think a lot of that legislation centers around price discrimination and kind of FTC type stuff, which is all around ripping people off. Are we talking about making sure ISPs are providing the speeds. All this is like over here in Moneyland, and the Telecom Act is like, if you drop too many calls, you will go to prison. It's much more severe in terms of the uptime requirements and the correlating like penalties. Like it's a wild escalation compared to even.
Yeah, I mean,
let's talk about how weird this is. So I'm on my cell phone. I just get out of my car and I'm walking into my house and I'm on a cellular network. I walk, and that's a fully regulated process there. I walk into my house, it jumps on the Wi-Fi, completely unregulated. But if I use the voice over IP on there to call somebody, the other end of that call is regulated. I mean, it's really nuts what we've done to this thing.
Right, but also I think it's we could potentially have Harold Feld on sometime to talk about how the regulations have changed, because states have a lot of authority over this, and some of those regulations that you're talking about, Spencer, used to be that like after a major storm you had to restore service within X number of hours, and now AT&T can just say we're never restoring service, you're done. And so like there's a major shift in how we approach this.
Verizon tried that on Fire Island, remember? Yeah.
Right, and we'll see this I think with in Florida with that hurricane that just came through, or the next one that's coming through, because Florida expressly gave AT&T that power to decide where and when it would rebuild, if ever.
Right.
Oh jeez.
Well, I mean, if this regulation's that strict for dropping calls, people go to jail. They should be going to jail every single day at my house.
Nobody ever went to jail for it.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, it sounds good, but
however, people did get some fines. I mean, there's been So
I could drop a call every 5-6 times a day if you want. Who should we send to prison, Chris?
Go ahead, Spencer.
Yeah, sure. I was gonna riff a little bit more on something that's really fuzzy to me, because what we're seeing right now, and like I think about this kind of stuff all the time, because I've heard rumors of like there's always a question of like, in my mind, if telcos, more and more telcos are using stuff like VoIP, and so it's like, well, are they an ISP? What is a telco like? I have all these questions, right? And if anyone knows a really smart telecom lawyer, I'd love to have them explain this to me, because I have questions around like, cool, like does WhatsApp count? I hear no. What if they provided this? There's so many different.
Yeah, we can talk about that in a future show. We could bring on Harold Feld, who I think would be one of the best to talk about that.
Yeah, because it gets really fuzzy, really fast. And I've heard rumors of I had some colleagues who were like at Facebook and kind of involved with some efforts, and I heard rumors of like, you're inventing stuff and it's cool and you're doing connectivity and it's going cool, and then all of a sudden you get a little bit too close to like, are we doing something that might look like a telco thing? And like an army of lawyers comes like running down and is like, don't do this. You can't do this. Like,
and sometimes I think that's because of overregulation, and sometimes it's an overreaction to existing reasonable regulations.
Well, it's actually also an overreaction to copyright laws. Unfortunately, all these folks have copyrights or patents. I mean, patents on these various technologies. You just do not want to touch them. So yes.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I remember at Apple, learning that the penalties were so much worse for willful infringement. There was a company-wide policy of like, do not read any patents ever.
Right.
Next slide. There we go.
Yeah, let's do it. All right. So we kind of riffed on a lot of these notes, but in kind of the bellhead kind of telco world, right? For them to hit these service guarantees, they need to have a ton of control over the invisibility into the network, right? And so they need to know if they're going to prioritize phone calls so they don't drop them. They need to know what a phone call is, right? They need to like treat it separately, and they need to like know when you're calling someone versus you just like your phone's just sending packets, YOLO, who cares? So a lot of these kind of needs and these regulatory stuff are why everything feels so complex, and in my opinion, feels like over-engineered. But these, they're also trying to hit these really hard metrics, and I see it again, like we've been riffing on this. I see it as kind of control freaky, and it's just wild to hit these two different attitudes. And so we kind of talked a little bit about quality of service, right? They're really trying to they're trying to prioritize phone calls by putting them on separate channels still. Another example that I still think is really interesting is emergency 911 traffic. I don't know if this is what you meant earlier when someone was talking about there's an emergency and everyone's placing calls, but even SIM card or not, telcos are required to take 911 calls and route them, and to prioritize them to the degree of like, cool, if your network's busy, kick someone else off. So you have all sorts of like features, and they're interesting to me. And this is also because I've done some work in telco land and also in networking land. in our lab, we sometimes talk about things like, what would emergency service over a Wi-Fi network look like? Like, how can you do that today? Like, we ask all sorts of weird questions by just inverting things. We talk all the time about, like, what if there's no cell service and you have someone's with Starlink way out in the here, like, can I get, and his Wi-Fi is password protected, but I need to get on and place a call. Like it's, you start seeing this big merge in different services and stuff like that. But I highlight a lot of these things that often get kind of taken for granted, even as much as I hate a lot of the control freak attitudes that you see in telco policies and regulations, and even in the standards that are built. So LTE is kind of an ISP technology. It's kind of a telco technology. And I often think about it, this is kind of the biggest analogy that I find helpful is brackish water is basically where fresh water comes into salt water. And they're super unique ecosystems. They change salinity based on the tides multiple times a day, like how much salt water is in like that riverbank. And you see really weird creatures. There's a lot of like plants and animals that can only live in areas like this because it's just so specific. And this is my favorite LTE analogy, just because I like water and being outdoors. Moving a bit forward though, because you mentioned having Deb on a couple of times, and in general, ISPs have started to talk about LTE, which is, I'm sure the interested audience here. And so the interesting thing about LTE is that I mentioned that it's kind of oriented, it's architected kind of a little bit more. It's packet switched. It's based on IP packets. And so you take a handset that never moves, like that's easy. You take a handset that never makes a phone call, like sure, right? And now you're basically talking about a hotspot. You take said hotspot, you give it a much stronger antenna, and now you're talking about consumer premise equipment. And a lot of ISPs now, especially smaller wireless ones, have been rolling out LTE just like with a number of technologies. There's now products made specifically for this. We've got a nice little bi-cell CPE on this slide. You can mount it on a house. You can totally get it 100 megabits. And it's pretty reliable. And you can start really taking advantage of some of like the higher bandwidth channels. You can start taking advantage of like a lot of the optimization. And a lot of people aren't doing this, but you can have a tremendous amount of control. And there's all these little knobs you can twiddle if you want to.
So I have a question. Where do you launch it, or where do you attach it if it's on a dome? I'm just questioning.
I don't know. That was well before smartphones.
Okay.
I don't think we had internet. But I also lived with a bunch of crazy hippies at that time. People like didn't want microwaves because they thought those would give you cancer too.
Was it considered a peace camp, or what was it considered?
It was.
Don't answer that. I was just enjoying whenever I go back and watch the old movies when they called the microwave science ovens, which is a way better term for the microwave.
Come on, baby, in a dome. I love it. This is the greatest ever.
So actually, those domes at UC Davis, you can look them up. They were in the 70s. They built a bunch of experimental housing. It was like supposed to run for like a 5-year project, but they were so well engineered that they just lasted forever. And you could tell the university admin super hates that they're still around. And everyone's like, no, our lease is still valid. Like, you have to like let us keep living here.
They're still there today?
Yes.
Oh, that's epic. All right, hang on. I got to Google this.
Yeah, UC Davis domes.
Travis is going to be driving through there next year.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
I was there about 6 years ago. They're still there, Travis. Oh, yeah.
Let's see the next slide.
Sorry?
Is there a next slide?
Yes. So there's been a lot of talk about LTE, I think.
So let's just talk about when you say building a network, like, I mean, I kind of took for granted that you could use LTE to build networks. So when you say you couldn't do it 6 years ago, why couldn't you do it 6 years ago?
That is this slide.
Okay.
So if you wanted to do this in the mid 2010s, like, sure, theoretically possible, great. Probably forget it. And a lot of stuff has changed. I guess in here I started with hardware. In the last handful of years, a lot of like lower budget manufacturers have entered the game and have started bringing like LTE radios to market, and this has had a huge effect on prices. A lot of radios now at the lower end can start under $1,000. When we bought them in 2017, we were looking at $5,000 or $5,000 or $6,000 each. But somehow due to some of the patents in 2G radios still retail for like 20 to 30K. So there's been a lot of market competition that is like prices have sank like a stone. I feel like I've just watched the zeros fall off them. So that's a huge game changer in terms of hardware. Software, it's been a similar arc. When we got started, we were going to run this network in Papua. I found some open source LTE software that was like 80% done and 20% broken. And so I also asked around to get bids. I was like, hey, maybe I could buy a license for some core software, but there's not really a market for that back in the day because it was just telecoms buying it or rolling their own. So I think the cheapest quote I could find was like $80,000 or $100,000 or something for a license. And it can scale up to like 1 million users, and like that's okay, but there's like 500 people in this village. And so my salary was, low enough that I was like, it just makes way more sense for us to fix this existing open source stuff. And that was kind of a grind. It also was rewarding. But the software situation to run the network has changed dramatically since then. Like I'm talking about $100,000 licenses, and now there's at least 2 or 3 open source options that are pretty reliable, work pretty good. We run them in production, so like I'm pleased enough with it. And there's also a bunch of closed source kind of cloud offerings that are like $1 a user a month. So there's like that market has also just been obliterated, right? We're talking like several zeros have fallen off here. And this also goes hand in hand with, I guess, the last point that is worth mentioning is, when I'm comparing things to 2G, for example, 2G had 4 bands. National telcos are going to buy them and use them to provide cellular service. LTE was standardized in over 60. There's some that are really low, 400 megahertz. There's some that are up at like 6 or 8 gigahertz. And so that's made a lot of competition. There's a lot of, bands out there, and we've talked a lot about 2.5 or CBRS and 3.65. But they also make LTE radios that just run in unlicensed 5 gigahertz. Like it feels like bizarro to me. But there's a lot of additional bands and a lot of spectrum access as well. So
now remember, all this was done for the third world. We just happen to benefit from it here. That's why they got so cheap, right? So
yeah, this is true.
So the importance of the spectrum is I'm guessing different parts of the spectrum have different qualities if you're in different areas, but then also you're going to have access to different parts of the spectrum also, like just legally, right?
And in different countries, totally different uses of spectrum a lot of times. Yeah. So
yeah.
And then my other question is, why is the core software so complicated? Like, is it primarily because you have different stations that can hear different devices and they have to coordinate? And like, what are all the different things that the core software has to do that's so complicated?
Great question. And I think the bummer about core software, and this is kind of one of my top like bummer notions of LTE, is you have all these knobs and whistles and all this stuff that software do that the software has to do. And so it's really ripe for bugs. And some of the complexities, it's kind of one of these things where you can't, what am I trying to say? You can't build it 90% of the way and then call it good. Because the base station, you're going to buy a commercial base station and it's going to be sending your software all these complex messages and it needs the exact responses back. And there might be stuff like, oh yeah, the only reason we have all that complex features is to support mobility. And we know that we're never going to have any mobility in our network. We're just like mounting things on houses. But the radio doesn't know that. It still needs to know the exact, like the exact identifiers, how we're going to identify this handset. There's really hardcore encryption. So you need to do a ton of work with like SIM cards and keys and all that. And that's not because you need it to be that ridiculously over-engineered. It's because that's what the thing is going to send you to be compliant with the specification.
Again, remember, these core softwares are developed by cell phone companies. So, I mean, you could start from scratch and do a way simpler one, but no one's going to do that. So,
yeah.
Well,
so
maybe.
So we've built a pretty straightforward one. I would say it's engineered as well as it could be, and it's very straightforward. But the spec is very complicated, and that's what you can't get around unless you're also changing radios and handsets and things.
Yeah.
It's worth mentioning. The other thing that I think is worth mentioning that
you should build your an LTE that does not support mobility and call it stable LTE.
Like it, right? There you go. So for a while there was some mobility stuff we couldn't get working in Papua. So when people walked from one side of the village to the other, it would just like the phone would cut out and reconnect as it changed base stations. But we kept giving them the same IP address so they didn't notice. It was wonderful. Oh man, I was going to say something along the lines of course. Oh, the other thing that I think is kind of both a blessing and a curse, and this is kind of a rant I have actually about the whole notion of carrier grade, is the stuff is designed. It's like pretty hard to set up. There's all sorts of weird roadblocks. But then once you get everything running smoothly and you're like, yeah, victory, it's all built as if you're going to scale up to, it's intending for you to scale up to tens of thousands of units or like millions. So it feels like this huge amount of lift. And if you're trying to support all these small networks, it's like lift after lift after lift. But if you want to take one network and grow it, by the time you've got all the stuff lined up, it's like wham, bam, plug and play. Great, get another one. Let's go. Like you can really grease the rollout. But that's often not the model, I think, of like smaller ISPs that have a network that's maybe half built and want to add like 2 towers. Like if you want to add like 1 or 2 towers, you're doing all the work up front, even if you're never going to reap the benefits of that scale. And that's just kind of embedded in the way the specifications and things are intended and designed. It's like, it doesn't have to be that way. It's just as it shook out.
Mm-hmm. We had to say goodbye to Kim at the top of the hour. We got a little bit of time left.
Oh, cool. That was my last thing.
Oh, there you go. So usually here's where we find out Travis has had like 3 questions and he's been waiting to ask them.
Well, I want to bring up the big elephant in the room, 13G, that's going to kill fiber. So how's that spec coming along? No, it's interesting. I think the adoption is just amazing to me. Every person you see everywhere they go, every car, utilizing it it's quite amazing how far the technology's come. I'm not real sold on it being an ultimate somebody's streaming media platform to their home due to the lack of mounting options there generally are in major cities. But, as far as a phone technology, it's not bad. But, what's interesting is, remember growing up with a typical 1FB phone line, how reliable those things were? Yeah. You'd sit on the phone forever and ever and ever. So sometimes I think we move forward, but sometimes I think we've moved back a little bit in our move here.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting. But I would ask, what is your favorite open source backend? Do you have one that you like?
Yeah, there's Open5GS is one that I work on. I'll always plug it. It's great. It's so the Osmocom people with Harold Welt and all them, that's they have started committing to it, which in my mind is a great sign that it's kind of everyone's kind of converging around it. If you look around, there's the Magma project was started by some great folks, like good friends of mine it was at Facebook. Now it's Linux Foundation. I think it's a little bit more spin it up and scale. It's got a really specific use case. So it often doesn't really fit the stuff I do as much. But I like the designers of it a lot, even though they're not, they've since moved on. Yeah, but those two, I'll always plug Open5GS, which has now been getting into 5G, hence the name. They used to be called Next DPC, I think, but then there was a commercial version, like
Yeah. No, thanks. I'll look at that one. I've never used it before because that's always been the big hang up about deploying this, especially for the WISPs, is to hang up a Cambium ePMP platform. It's like 3 clicks of a button and you're running. But to get a core up and going and operating, and it takes some work. Yeah, it takes some work.
Yeah, and I think it's tricky because like I'm constantly talking with people about that, and I want to support ISPs running their total, like just owning all their own everything, and then that crashes against, all right, this is so hard. Tell you what, we should set up a public core and just let anyone connect to it. Yeah. And then you're like, are we just becoming another one of those like are we now just becoming the control freaks that are scaling, right? Because you want to support people in their traffic, and so
I'm telling you, it would be a good service for the guys just getting into it as they learn and evolve. Because I think the core tends to scare people off, in the beginning. And I think it shouldn't. But I do like the fact that when you are hopping LTE cell, you use the same trick we use on Wi-Fi. Just give them the same address, and the customer never knows. They miss a ping or two, and off they go. So that's the old trick we use with Wi-Fi roaming.
Well, so the funny thing about that, actually, because when this network that we were building out in Papua, we could never get the voice side of things to work for a large number of reasons. It's an entirely different conversation. But and I really wanted to support voice and text, so we could do things like so that I could text people in the network, like asking them to stop crashing it. But anyways, we kept saying, all right, guys, like we've got the network running, but we're still trying to figure out voice and text. and no one cared because everyone was just on WhatsApp anyways.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, we only use WhatsApp. So like, okay, great. That if you're happy, I'm happy. And so by keeping the same IP address, the calls actually, like actual voice would drop, but WhatsApp ones wouldn't.
Keep on working, right? Yeah.
And then that's really like, I don't know. We build all these funky networks because we're running handsets, but we're not doing voice. And I mentioned it earlier, but then this question of like, are we a telco is always like, I don't know, what is a telco today, right? Is WhatsApp?
Yeah.
Doug, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just saying WhatsApp has got to be the most used app in the world.
Oh, it's crazy.
I mean, everybody uses it. I mean, third world, that's what every single person uses. Yeah. So.
And you don't run into a lot of Americans that do. But if you want to talk to any of your friends overseas, WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's they are I read some research years ago that basically kind of compared, and WhatsApp, because especially it's like it's been used, it's become really so popular in so much of the developing world context. They are substantially better even than 2G when it comes to optimizing over low bandwidth.
Yeah.
Like these guys did a bunch of research and they're like, man, these guys are the total kings of getting stuff across in like really, really constrained contexts.
Because they have to, when you're out in the middle of nowhere, there's not a lot of bandwidth there.
Yeah.
So what's interesting, like in terms of what's coming next? We'll talk more about this in the future in terms of some industry trends, but from a technological point of view, Spencer, like, I think you did a bunch of work with Althea. They seem like they're trying to get bigger now. And Deb, we wanted to have Deb on the show, but she had a conflict. And so that's why she's not here. But I get the sense that some of the stuff that they're working on now is getting even more complicated and maybe pushing you to your limits, or like what exactly is going on there?
Pushing me to my limits.
I thought like some of the stuff that they're trying to do with LTE, like with the core that you are programming and things like that was hitting, basically your talent level, your experience level, or something like that.
It's been fun. Yeah. We've done a lot of I've been building, we've been kind of doing this in terms of the LTE side of things. We've been doing like this hybrid core where we've got a lot of the core logic as much as we can up in the cloud somewhere. But then all the traffic stays local and gets routed out locally so that it's really easier to put it in just like an existing ISP context. This was Travis. This was also going to be my answer for the core as a services. You should talk to Deb because like that's what we're trying to roll out. So like she can hook you up. We can do this.
So if I'm trying to understand, is that like, because I really have no sense of how this actually works, but basically like the core is able to like orchestrate things without having to be in the middle of everything. Like, is that a way of saying it?
Like, what's the minimum amount of core logic that we need, or like, what's the minimum that we need in the network at the edge, and as much as possible, put it up in the cloud or somewhere where we can just keep iterating it and fixing on it. That stuff's been really fun. We got the stuff that needs to run at the edge of the network. We got that really, really slim. And then we actually ported it over to OpenWRT. So you can run things on there. And that's always kind of like a fun, like mashup of like a different world that I used to poke around in grad school.
But this is where you bump against telco. See, in telco, one of their key concepts has always been let the backbone go down, local survivability stays, and people can continue to talk to each other. You move the core to the cloud and local's gone too. So that's just a different philosophy. I mean, they almost started the whole network from that perspective because it was built around those one little operator center with 20 plugs in for a farming community. That could keep on working no matter what the hell else happened, right? So
it's really interesting to think about how we scale resilience though, because you're right that the telcos were designed in this way to start to allow local chunks to still run. Yeah. But this is also because we're talking about one company looking at things nationwide as opposed to an ISP that is either all up or all down, but it's smaller than that local, what was it, the central office scale for the telcos anyways. So it's like, there's so many questions of where you slice the pie, right? How top heavy or bottom heavy it is.
Any other questions?
Well, I'll leave you with this thought. If you ever do underground work for building a fiber network and you accidentally hit one of the bundles of twisted pair coming out of a CO that was called in the early 1900s, wow. And if you ever see them fix it, it is amazing. All those tiny little strands in there
Yeah, all different colors. It's
So are you just
yeah.
familiar with that, or did one of your crews hit one?
Whoops. Yeah, we hit one time. It wasn't marked, but wow. Talk about it. You got to commend the people, though. That was installed in the early 1900s, and still that thing ran strong for years and years and years. So I commend them. I hope the stuff we're putting in has the same life cycle to it.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Spencer, anything else that comes to mind before we wrap up?
No, this was great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Super interesting.
Yeah, very good.
Happy
Thank
to
you.
talk more.
Yeah, it's I think it's always it's interesting because I think a lot of us have like different pieces of this, and then just getting different people together to remember some of the different aspects of it. It's wild.
Absolutely.
Cool. We are looking at coming back next week, I believe, for one of our regular shows, talking about current events in the news. I believe that Ana Gomez is the 5th commissioner now officially.
You're having her on the show, right?
No, I would not expect Ana Gomez to be interested in coming on this show. And I think we'll have a lot to talk about next week. Unfortunately, we'll be doing it without Doug because Doug will be busy, and we'll find another person to step in. If anyone else knows a 150-year-old Grateful Dead fan that spent a lot of time in telecom,
perhaps I was like, I know just the dude.
Perhaps with Santa Claus aspirations. We will be back, and then at some point, I don't know if it'll be in September or it'll be in October, but Spencer, I'll be in touch with you to see if we can schedule another show to talk about the future of LTE. I want to spend a little bit of time. I really want to get like Mike Dano on from Light Reading to talk a bit about kind of like all the things we were lied to about, like, for the past 4 years or so from the telcos, the wireless companies, about how, like 5G this, and, what would be amazing would be have Nilay Patel on. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the Vergecast, but every now and then he just goes off about like just the lies about what we're going to do with 5G and the robot surgery and all of this different stuff. In fact, in this show last week, I think they were talking about, there's a video about a banana having a robot surgery performed on it as a demo, and it was not done over wireless, it turns out, even though that's what the lies about it say. So
I got so tired of the hype train. I want to make a joke talk that's like, will 5G cure cancer or cause cancer?
Right. Yeah. No, but I mean, the thing is that, like, even if it caused it, it could resolve it right away because of the robot doctors in the cars on the freeways doing surgery everywhere. And no one ever talked to anyone from the insurance agent, from the insurance world, to find out, like, even if this was technically possible, would you do surgery over a 5G connection? Hell no, you would not, because if the slightest
the
glitch
network
happened,
drops.
yeah,
Yes.
who's paying the patient's family? That's the question. It's not about the tech.
In all fairness, though, I'd like an apology for the thousands of conversations I had at banks about how fiber was irrelevant and 5G was going to take over. So,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, because they watched all the TV commercials. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. So.
Yeah. No, it's just ridiculous. But I think it would be interesting to find out like exactly what has happened. I mean, yeah, I don't read it super closely, but I've seen stories about how, like AT&T and Verizon were lying outright. They never made they made these promises, and then they never actually purchased the gear that would have allowed them to meet those promises. They never did any of the steps, and it'd be fun to have someone on that could talk a bit about some of that.
I mean, to be fair to Verizon, they had their hands full. They were busy throttling first responders.
They're in California, right?
I expect them to do everything, right?
So anyway, it's been fun trotting out past memory lane a little bit. This is ordinarily where I just wait for Rye to get set up, but I actually have to do it myself. So preparing the outro. Spencer, thank you. Travis and Doug, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Kim, who had to get on to another event. But we will be back, I believe, in 6 days with a show covering the news. Yes, Travis. Or are you just doing this? That's what my son does to me all the time now.
No, I was going to say thank you, Mr. Mitchell, for being the host extraordinaire of this episode 79.
Yes, and you didn't bomb it. That was awesome. Yes.
Well, yeah, and we didn't get you riled up, but I promise, episode 80,
Here it comes.
It's coming. So.
Yeah, it's coming. All right. Spencer, thank you also for all the great work you do for the tribal broadband boot camps and folks. Just go back. Actually, that was the other thing. If we had extra time, I would love to just hear more about was it Uluhaktuk? Is that where you just were?
Mhm.
Yeah, up there in the on the Arctic Circle. So next time maybe we'll reserve some.
Next time
we'll talk about that some. The challenges of building these networks in the Arctic. If people want to hear about it, maybe we can get Mark on too. But would be fun. All right, I'm going to play us out, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.